Have you ever looked at an old photograph and felt like something was off? Today, we're diving into one of the most disturbing mysteries hidden in plain sight. A Christmas portrait from 1898 that conceals a truth so shocking, it remained buried for over a century. Before we begin, if you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. And speaking of growth, I'm also developing another channel with even more mysterious content. Check the description below to find it. It was December 2019 when Dr. Margaret Collins, a historian specializing in post-Civil War America, received a donation to the Boston Historical Society. Among hundreds of dusty albums and loose photographs, one particular image caught her attention. The photograph showed a wealthy family gathered in an ornately decorated parlor on Christmas Eve, 1898. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, garlands draped across the mantelpiece, and beneath a towering Christmas tree sat carefully wrapped presents. The family, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore and their 3 children, posed with the stiff formality typical of the era, their expensive clothing and confident expressions radiating prosperity and pride. Dr. Collins had seen thousands of similar photographs throughout her career. Victorian families loved documenting their wealth and status, and Christmas portraits were particularly popular among the upper class. She almost filed the image away without a second thought, but something made her pause. Perhaps it was the way the shadows fell across the room, or maybe the unusual composition that seemed to deliberately draw the eye toward the background. Whatever the reason, she decided to examine the photograph more closely. Using the Society's high-resolution scanner, Dr. Collins began the painstaking process of digitizing the image. As the photograph appeared on her computer screen, pixel by pixel, she noticed something she hadn't seen with the naked eye. In the far background, partially obscured by the shadow of a large armoire, stood a figure. The person was positioned in such a way that they were barely visible in the original print, almost as if they had been deliberately placed where the camera's limited depth of field would render them indistinct. Dr. Collins leaned closer to her monitor, her heart beginning to race. She increased the magnification, adjusting the contrast and brightness to bring out details that had remained hidden for more than a century. The figure was that of a young black man, probably in his early 20s. Despite the photograph being taken 33 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, his presence in the Whitmore household told a story that contradicted the official narrative of post-war American society. But it wasn't just his presence that disturbed Dr. Collins, it was his posture. While the Whitmore family sat relaxed and proud, this young man stood rigid, his body language conveying something between fear and defiance. His eyes, barely visible in the grainy enhancement, seemed to stare directly at the camera with an intensity that transcended the limitations of 19th century photography. Then, Dr. Collins noticed his hands. In his right hand, partially concealed behind his back, he held something. She spent the next hour adjusting the image, trying to identify the object. It appeared to be rectangular, possibly a book or a box, but there was something else. Markings on whatever he was holding, symbols or letters that refused to come into focus, no matter how much she manipulated the digital image. Over the following weeks, Dr. Collins became obsessed with the photograph. She researched the Whitmore family extensively, discovering that Charles Whitmore had made his fortune in textile manufacturing after the Civil War. The family had lived in a mansion in Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood, an area known for its concentration of old money and social conservatism. According to census records and city directories, the Whitmores employed several domestic workers, but there was no mention of any black employees, unusual for a household of their size and wealth. Dr. Collins reached out to genealogists, hoping to identify the young man in the photograph. She posted queries on historical forums and contacted descendants of other prominent Boston families from the same era. The responses she received were puzzling. Several people claimed their ancestors had mentioned the Whitmores in less than flattering terms, referring to strange occurrences at their household and secrets best left undisturbed. But no one could provide concrete information. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. An elderly woman named Ruth Harrison contacted Dr. Collins after seeing her inquiry on a genealogy website. Ruth explained that her great-grandmother had worked as a seamstress for several wealthy Boston families in the 1890s, including the Whitmores. Before her death in 1967, Ruth's great-grandmother had told stories about the Whitmore household, stories that Ruth had always assumed were exaggerated or confused memories of an old woman. According to these accounts, the Whitmores had harbored a dark secret. Despite slavery being abolished decades earlier, they had continued to keep a young black man in their service under conditions that closely resembled bondage. The family had apparently brought him north from a plantation they owned in Virginia before the war, and through a combination of legal manipulation, intimidation, and isolation, had managed to keep him effectively enslaved well into the 1890s. Ruth's great-grandmother had claimed that the young man, whose name she couldn't remember, had tried multiple times to escape, but was always caught and returned. She spoke of hearing screams from the Whitmore mansion late at night and seeing the young man with fresh injuries. Most disturbing of all, she mentioned that he had kept a journal, documenting everything that happened to him, everything he witnessed, and everyone who was complicit in his captivity. Dr. Collins felt a chill run down her spine as she listened to Ruth's account. Could the object in the photograph be that journal? She returned to the enhanced image with renewed purpose, studying every pixel of the rectangular object in the young man's hand. The more she looked, the more convinced she became that it was indeed a small book or journal. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me continue creating this type of content, but questions multiplied faster than answers. If this young man had been held against his will, why would the Whitmores allow him to appear in a family photograph, even partially obscured? Was it arrogance, or did they simply not consider him human enough to matter? And what about the journal? If that's what it was, what happened to it? Most importantly, what became of the young man himself? Dr. Collins scoured death records, cemetery logs, and hospital admissions from the period. She found nothing. It was as if, after this photograph was taken, the young man had simply vanished from all official records. No death certificate, no burial record, no trace of his existence beyond this single photographic image. As Christmas 2019 approached, Dr. Collins found herself unable to stop thinking about the photograph. She had it printed and hung on the wall of her office, studying it during breaks in her other work. Colleagues began to worry about her fixation, suggesting she was reading too much into an unclear image. But Dr. Collins couldn't shake the feeling that the young man in the photograph was trying to tell her something across the gulf of more than a century, that his deliberate positioning, his defiant posture, and that object clutched in his hand were all part of a message meant to outlive him and his captors. January 2020 brought a harsh New England winter, but Dr. Collins's investigation burned hotter than ever. She had begun to piece together fragments of the Whitmore family history, and each new discovery made the photograph more disturbing. The mansion where the Christmas portrait had been taken still stood on Beacon Hill, though it had changed hands several times over the decades. Currently, it housed a law firm on the lower floors, while the upper levels remained vacant, a detail that would soon become significant. Dr. Collins decided to approach the building's current owners for permission to examine the property. She presented her research to the managing partners of Sterling & Associates, emphasizing the historical importance of documenting the building's past. After several meetings and the signing of numerous liability waivers, she was granted access to the upper floors for a period of 2 weeks. The interior of the old Whitmore mansion was a time capsule. While the lower floors had been modernized for office use, the upper levels remained largely unchanged since the early 20th century. Crown molding traced elaborate patterns across the ceilings, and original hardwood floors creaked beneath Dr. Collins's feet as she explored room after room. She carried a copy of the Christmas photograph, trying to identify the exact location where it had been taken. It took her 3 days to find the room. The layout had been altered over the years. Walls added, doorways sealed, but she eventually identified the parlor by the distinctive molding around the fireplace mantel, still visible in a corner that had escaped renovation. Standing in that space, Dr. Collins felt an overwhelming sense of presence, as if the room itself remembered what had happened there more than a century ago. She brought in ground-penetrating radar equipment borrowed from a colleague in archaeology. The technology could reveal hidden spaces behind walls or beneath floors, places where something might have been concealed. The results were startling. Behind what appeared to be a solid wall, the radar indicated a void approximately 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide, a hidden space deliberately walled off at some point in the building's history. Getting permission to open the wall took another week of negotiations. Finally, with a structural engineer present and a restoration specialist standing by, workers carefully removed the plaster and lath. As the dust settled and light penetrated the darkness for the first time in decades, Dr. Collins's flashlight beam revealed a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a person to stand in. At the far end, barely visible, sat a small wooden crate. Dr. Collins's hands trembled as she donned gloves and carefully retrieved the crate. It was locked, but the wood had deteriorated enough that the lock gave way easily. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had partially preserved them from moisture and decay, were documents. Personal letters, household accounts, legal papers, and buried beneath them all, a small leather-bound journal. The journal's pages were brittle, the ink faded but still legible. On the first page, written in careful, educated handwriting, were the words, "My name is Samuel. They took my family name from me, but they cannot take my truth. If you are reading this, I am likely dead, but my story will finally be told." Over the next several hours, Dr. Collins photographed each page of the journal, terrified that handling it might cause further deterioration. What she read transformed the Christmas photograph from a historical curiosity into evidence of a crime that had never been prosecuted. Samuel's journal revealed that he had been brought north by the Whitmores in 1863, when he was only 7 years old. His mother had been enslaved on the Whitmore plantation in Virginia, and when the family fled north ahead of advancing Union forces, they took Samuel with them. While legally he should have been free in Massachusetts, the Whitmores kept him isolated, uneducated about his rights, and convinced him that the law didn't apply to someone like him. As Samuel grew older, he became aware of his situation. He learned to read by secretly studying newspapers left in rooms he cleaned. He began to understand that what was being done to him was illegal, that he had rights, that there were people who would help him if only he could reach them. But the Whitmores kept him under constant surveillance. He was never allowed to leave the house unaccompanied, never permitted to interact with outsiders, never given money or documents that might enable his escape. The journal detailed his daily humiliations and occasional outright violence. It named names, not just the Whitmores, but dinner guests who knew of his situation and said nothing, local officials who were bribed to ignore his existence, and even a police officer who had once returned Samuel to the house after a failed escape attempt. But the most chilling entries came from late 1898, the weeks leading up to Christmas. Samuel wrote about a growing sense of doom, a conviction that the Whitmores were planning something. He had overheard fragments of conversations, noticed the family acting strangely around him, caught Mr. Whitmore looking at him with an expression that combined calculation and something darker. On December 20th, 1898, Samuel wrote, "They are planning to take my photograph tomorrow as part of their Christmas portrait. Mrs. Whitmore insisted I stand in the background, barely visible. She said it would be amusing to have me there without guests noticing. I believe this is meant to mock me, to demonstrate their power even in something as permanent as a photograph. But I have decided to use this opportunity. Now I'll continue creating the remaining chapters of the story with authentic historical context and atmospheric detail. I will position myself where they can see this journal in my hand, though they will not know what it is. I will stand as a witness to my own captivity, evidence preserved in glass and silver that I existed, that I resisted, that I am not nothing." The final dated entry was December 24th, 1898, the day of the photograph. Samuel wrote, "It is done. The photograph was taken this morning. I stood exactly where Mrs. Whitmore directed, but I held my journal where the camera could capture it, even if only as a blur. Mr. Whitmore noticed, became furious, demanded the photographer destroy the plate. But the photographer, I believe his name was Mr. Hendricks, refused, saying the exposure was already made and the family looked perfect in the frame. Mr. Whitmore paid him extra to ensure only prints that minimized my presence would be produced. But the plate exists. Somewhere, the truth exists." Dr. Collins felt tears streaming down her face as she read Samuel's words. Here was a man who understood he might not survive to see justice, but who fought to leave evidence anyway. But the journal didn't end there. There were several more pages, written in a different hand, shakier, more urgent. These entries were dated late December 1898 through January 1899, written by someone who identified herself only as E.M. From context, Dr. Collins deduced this was likely Emma Matthews, a kitchen maid mentioned earlier in Samuel's entries as one of the few servants who showed him kindness. Emma's entries were devastating. On December 26th, she wrote, "Samuel is gone. They say he ran away, but I heard the screams from the cellar 2 nights ago, Christmas night. I heard Mr. Whitmore shouting and the sound of something heavy being dragged. In the morning, Samuel was gone, and there was blood on the cellar stairs, hastily cleaned. Mrs. Whitmore told the staff that Samuel had stolen silver and fled, that we should speak of him to no one or face dismissal and criminal charges ourselves for harboring a thief. Emma continued documenting her suspicions over the following weeks. She noted that Mr. Whitmore made several nighttime trips with his carriage, accompanied by his eldest son. She observed that a section of the cellar floor appeared to have been freshly concreted. Most chillingly, she wrote of finding Samuel's journal hidden in a gap behind a loose brick in his tiny room. She had taken it and hidden it, along with other documents she'd secretly copied from Mr. Whitmore's desk. Documents that suggested his complicity in maintaining illegal servitude wasn't limited to Samuel. Emma's final entry was dated January 15th, 1899. I have hidden these papers behind the wall in the old servants' passage that Mr. Whitmore sealed last year. I sealed them in wax cloth with the hope that someone, someday, might find them. I cannot go to the authorities. Mr. Whitmore has too many connections, and I have nothing but my word against his. They would call me hysterical, or worse. I am leaving this house tomorrow. I have told Mrs. Whitmore my mother is ill in Providence. In truth, I can no longer sleep under this roof, knowing what I know. If you are reading this, please know that Samuel existed. He was kind, he was intelligent, and he deserved better than what was done to him. His name was Samuel, and he mattered. Dr. Collins sat in silence for a long time after reading those words. She had found what she was looking for, and more than she'd bargained for. Samuel's journal provided detailed evidence of a crime, but without Samuel's body, without concrete proof of murder rather than escape, could justice be served over a century later? She contacted Detective James Morrison of the Boston Police Department's Cold Case Unit. Morrison was initially skeptical. A crime from 1898 was far outside normal cold case parameters. But after reading portions of the journal and examining the photograph, he agreed to open an investigation. More accurately, he agreed to let Dr. Collins continue investigating while he provided official sanction and access to additional resources. The first step was ground-penetrating radar of the mansion's cellar. The law firm that owned the building was less enthusiastic about this phase of the investigation, but public interest in the story, which had begun to leak to local media, created pressure for them to cooperate. The radar scan revealed exactly what Emma's journal suggested: an anomaly beneath the concrete floor of the cellar in an area that building records confirmed had been modified in late December 1898. The anomaly was roughly 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2 feet deep, human-shaped. Leave a comment below about what you think happened to Samuel. I'd love to hear your theories. Obtaining permission to excavate was a legal nightmare involving city officials, historical societies, the medical examiner's office, and multiple lawyers. It took until March 2020 to get approval, and then the COVID-19 pandemic delayed everything further. It wasn't until August 2020 that a careful, forensically sound excavation finally began. Dr. Collins stood with Detective Morrison, a forensic anthropologist, and a team of specialists as they slowly removed the concrete and began carefully brushing away the dirt beneath. 17 inches down, they found fabric, deteriorated but identifiable as clothing from the late 19th century. 23 inches down, they found bones. The forensic anthropologist, Dr. Patricia Chen, worked with painstaking care over the following days. What emerged was the skeleton of a young black male, approximately 20 to 25 years old at time of death. The skull showed evidence of severe blunt force trauma, multiple fractures consistent with being struck repeatedly with a heavy object. Several ribs were also fractured. Dr. Chen's preliminary assessment: death by homicide, almost certainly occurring in late December 1898. But the most haunting discovery came when they carefully excavated around the body. Clutched in the skeletal hand bones, preserved by the concrete that had sealed the makeshift grave, was a small piece of paper. Using techniques normally reserved for ancient documents, conservators carefully separated and unfolded it. It was a page torn from Samuel's journal. The page contained a list of names: 13 people, including the Whitmores, who Samuel identified as knowing about or participating in his illegal captivity. Below the names, Samuel had written, "I do not know if I will survive what is coming, but if I die, and if this is ever found, know that I did not go silently. I spoke truth to power, even if power refused to listen. I am Samuel, and I was here." The discovery made national news. Historians, genealogists, and journalists began investigating the 13 names on Samuel's list. Several were prominent Boston families whose descendants still lived in the area. Some of those descendants immediately issued statements condemning their ancestors' actions. Others hired lawyers and issued denials, claiming the evidence was circumstantial or misinterpreted. The most shocking revelation came when researchers discovered that one of the names on the list belonged to a man who later became a Massachusetts state senator, serving from 1902 to 1910. His campaign literature had emphasized his commitment to civil rights and racial equality, even as he had witnessed and said nothing about Samuel's captivity just a few years earlier. Dr. Collins found herself at the center of a storm. She received praise for bringing Samuel's story to light, but also harassment from people who accused her of attacking Boston's founding families or manufacturing evidence. Security had to be increased at the Historical Society after threats were made. Through it all, she kept returning to the photograph. That single image, taken on Christmas Eve 1898, had set everything in motion. Samuel's deliberate positioning, his defiant posture, the journal held where the camera could see it, all of it had been his way of refusing to be erased, and more than a century later, his plan had worked. But questions remained. What happened to the photographer, Mr. Hendricks? Were there other prints or plates that showed Samuel more clearly? And most importantly, what happened to Samuel's family, his mother, the relatives he might have had in Virginia or elsewhere? Samuel's journal contained few personal details about his life before the Whitmores, as if speaking of his family was too painful or perhaps dangerous to them if his journal were discovered. By October 2020, the Samuel investigation had evolved from a historical curiosity into something much larger. The Boston District Attorney's Office had opened an official inquiry, not with any hope of prosecuting a crime from 122 years ago, but to create a comprehensive historical record and to examine whether any living individuals might have illegally concealed evidence of the crime in more recent decades. Dr. Collins had become the unofficial keeper of Samuel's story, fielding media requests, coordinating with researchers across the country, and meticulously documenting every new discovery. But the more she learned, the more she realized how little she actually knew. Samuel's journal, for all its detailed accounts of his daily suffering, revealed almost nothing about who he had been before the Whitmores took him. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In November 2020, Dr. Collins received an email from a genealogist named Marcus Turner, who lived in Richmond, Virginia. Marcus had been researching his own family history and had come across references to a Whitmore plantation in Virginia's Albemarle County. Cross-referencing with Dr. Collins's published research, he believed he might have found Samuel's family. According to Marcus's research, the Whitmore plantation had been called Oakmont and had operated from 1820 until Union forces liberated it in 1863. Plantation records, preserved in county archives and university collections, listed enslaved individuals by first name only, as was common. But Marcus had found something rare. A document from 1858 recording the birth of a child named Samuel to a woman named Rachel, who was noted as working in the main house. Marcus had continued tracing Rachel's story through various records. After the plantation was liberated, she appeared in Freedmen's Bureau records, asking for help locating her son, who had been taken north by the former masters. The Bureau had made inquiries, but the Whitmores denied ever bringing any enslaved persons to Massachusetts. Without resources or legal recourse, Rachel had been unable to push further. Marcus's research revealed that Rachel had eventually settled in Richmond, where she worked as a seamstress and became active in her church community. She had never stopped looking for Samuel. Her obituary from 1911 mentioned that she was predeceased by her beloved son Samuel, lost but never forgotten. Dr. Collins felt the weight of that phrase, lost but never forgotten. Rachel had died not knowing what happened to her son, probably imagining him alive somewhere, perhaps thinking he had forgotten her or been unable to find his way back. The truth, that he had never stopped being enslaved, that he had been murdered just as he tried to leave evidence of his captivity, would have devastated her, but at least it would have been closure. Working with Marcus, Dr. Collins began piecing together more of Samuel's early life. Through census records, bills of sale, and plantation journals, they learned that Rachel had been brought to Oakmont as a young girl, purchased from an estate sale in South Carolina. She had been trained as a lady's maid for Mrs. Whitmore and had accompanied the family on their summer travels. Samuel had been born at the plantation and from a young age had been brought into the main house to train as a house servant. The records suggested that Samuel's father had been a skilled carpenter who had been sold away when Samuel was about 3 years old, sent to a plantation in Georgia. Rachel had apparently been quite close to young Samuel, teaching him manners and how to avoid punishment, skills that would later help him survive in the Boston household, but couldn't ultimately save him. One particularly poignant document Marcus found was a letter from 1862 written by Mrs. Whitmore to her sister in Boston. In it, she complained about the uppity attitudes of enslaved people as Union forces drew nearer, and mentioned specifically that Rachel's son was becoming difficult to manage as he approached adolescence. The letter concluded with Mrs. Whitmore's plan to bring Samuel north, where he can be properly disciplined, away from the corrupting influence of all this war talk about freedom. Deal. This letter was damning evidence that the Whitmores had knowingly and deliberately transported Samuel to Massachusetts with the intent of keeping him in servitude, despite knowing that slavery was illegal there. It demolished any possible defense that they had simply been unaware of his legal status or Massachusetts law. But it was another discovery that truly shook Dr. Collins to her core. In December 2020, she received a package from an elderly woman in Vermont named Dorothy Hendricks Walsh. Dorothy explained that she was the great-granddaughter of Edward Hendricks, the photographer who had taken the Christmas portrait in 1898. According to family stories Dorothy had heard, Edward Hendricks had been disturbed by what he witnessed at the Whitmore house that day. He had noticed the young black man being positioned in the background and had seen the deliberate way the man held what appeared to be a small book. When Mr. Whitmore tried to pay him extra money to destroy the plate or ensure the young man wasn't visible in prints, Hendricks had become suspicious. Edward couldn't directly defy a powerful client like Whitmore. He had a business to protect and a family to feed. But according to Dorothy, he had kept the original glass plate negative and made several full prints that showed Samuel more clearly than the cropped versions he gave the Whitmores. Before he died in 1924, Edward had told his son that someday someone will want to know about that young man in the photograph, and when they do, this will be important. The package Dorothy sent contained 3 items. Edward Hendricks's original invoice book showing his payment from the Whitmores, including the suspicious additional payment for extra services. A written account Edward had recorded in his later years about his suspicions regarding the Whitmore household, and most incredibly, one of the original full prints of the Christmas photograph. If you're still with me on this journey, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. It really helps me bring more stories like this to you. Dr. Collins carefully removed the photograph from its protective sleeve. Unlike the version found at the Historical Society, this print was larger and showed the full room. And there in the background was Samuel, still partially obscured by shadows, but visible enough that his face could be seen more clearly. His expression was exactly as his journal had described, not quite defiant, not quite defeated, but determined. A man bearing witness to his own captivity, and the object in his hand was unmistakably a small book, held deliberately at an angle where the camera could capture it. Even in the 1898 photograph, you could see Samuel's thumb marking a specific page, as if he wanted anyone examining the image to know that specific pages contained something important. Dr. Collins had the new photograph digitized at the highest possible resolution. When enhanced, Samuel's face became startlingly clear. A young man with intelligent eyes and a strong jawline, someone you could imagine excelling at anything if given the opportunity. The enhancement also revealed something else. On the wall behind Samuel, partially visible, was a small framed sampler, the kind of needlework that was popular in Victorian households. The enhanced image revealed words stitched on the sampler, "The truth shall set you free." The irony was almost unbearable. Samuel had stood beneath those words, enslaved in a free state, holding the journal that contained his truth, posing for a photograph that his captors thought would demonstrate their power, but that he turned into evidence of their crime. Dr. Patricia Chen, the forensic anthropologist, had completed her full analysis of Samuel's remains by this time. Her report confirmed what the initial examination had suggested. Samuel had been struck repeatedly with a blunt object, likely a metal pipe or similar tool. The pattern of injuries suggested he had raised his arms to defend himself. His forearm bones showed defensive fractures. He had fought back. Dr. Chen's report also noted that Samuel had been in generally good health at the time of his death, with no signs of chronic malnutrition or disease. However, there were old healed fractures in his ribs and left wrist, consistent with previous physical abuse. Samuel's skeleton told the story of a young man who had endured violence before, had survived it, but finally encountered violence too extreme to overcome. The question of Samuel's final hours haunted Dr. Collins. His journal ended on Christmas Eve with the photograph being taken. Emma's entry suggested he was killed on Christmas night. What had happened in those hours between? Detective Morrison had been working with historians to examine the Whitmore family's records and correspondence from that period. In January 2021, he found something significant. A telegram sent by Charles Whitmore on December 26, 1898, to his brother in New York. The telegram was brief. Problem resolved. No further concern necessary. 2 days later, Charles Whitmore had met with his lawyer and updated his will. The timing was suspicious but not conclusive. However, Morrison also discovered that in January 1899, Charles Whitmore had paid a significant sum to a construction company for urgent cellar repairs and had insisted the work be done quickly and quietly at night, with no unnecessary workers involved. All the pieces pointed to the same conclusion. On Christmas night 1898, something had pushed the Whitmores, probably Charles Whitmore specifically, to murder Samuel. Perhaps Samuel had threatened to escape again. Perhaps someone had seen the photograph and Samuel's deliberate positioning had been discovered. Perhaps the simple act of defiance that the photograph represented had enraged Whitmore beyond control. Whatever the trigger, Samuel had been killed, probably in the cellar where his screams might be less likely to draw attention. His body had been buried in a shallow grave, and concrete had been poured over it. Emma, the kitchen maid, had witnessed the aftermath, hidden Samuel's journal, and fled the house as soon as she safely could. And the Whitmores had continued their privileged life, attending social events, doing business, and raising their children as if nothing had happened. The summer of 2021 brought both resolution and revelation to Samuel's story. DNA analysis, using advanced techniques that could extract genetic material from bones over a century old, had confirmed with near certainty that the remains found in the Whitmore cellar belonged to someone descended from West African ancestry, consistent with Samuel's known background. More importantly, genetic genealogists had been able to match that DNA with living descendants of Rachel, Samuel's mother. One of those descendants was Marcus Turner, the genealogist who had first identified the connection between the Whitmores and the Oakmont plantation. Learning that he was actually related to Samuel, that the story he'd been researching was his own family's story, had affected him profoundly. Marcus told Dr. Collins that he'd always known his family descended from enslaved people in Virginia, but he'd never imagined he'd be able to connect a face and a name to ancestors from that era, much less know the specific circumstances of their lives and death. There were others as well. Genetic genealogy identified at least 15 living individuals who shared Rachel's maternal line, descended from Rachel's sister, who had also survived enslavement and remained in Virginia. The family tree that researchers constructed showed that Rachel's line had persevered through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Great Migration, and the Civil Rights era. Samuel's relatives had become teachers, soldiers, business owners, artists, all the things Samuel might have been if he'd been allowed to live his life freely. On August 15, 2021, Samuel's remains were finally laid to rest. The service was held at Montaney Oak Cemetery in Boston's Mattapan neighborhood, a historically black cemetery that had been founded in 1852. The ceremony brought together an unusual mixture of people. Historians like Dr. Collins, genealogists like Marcus, representatives from civil rights organizations, clergy members, local politicians, and dozens of people who had followed Samuel's story through news coverage and felt compelled to bear witness. Marcus Turner gave the eulogy. He spoke about Samuel not as a victim, though he had been victimized, but as a man who had refused to accept the situation forced upon him. Samuel taught himself to read when he was forbidden education, Marcus said. He documented his truth when telling it might mean death. He positioned himself in a photograph to leave evidence, even if he couldn't leave alive. Samuel understood something profound, that the truth doesn't die just because we do. The truth waits, patient as stone, for someone to finally listen. Dr. Collins spoke as well, reading excerpts from Samuel's journal, his observations about the weather, his memories of his mother, his reflections on freedom and dignity. She wanted people to understand that Samuel hadn't been a symbol or a statistic. He had been a complete person with thoughts and dreams and a personality that came through even in the constrained circumstances in which he'd been forced to write. The gravestone, paid for by donations from hundreds of people who had followed the story, read simply, Samuel C., 1878, December 1898. My name is Samuel. I existed. I resisted. I am not nothing. The words were taken directly from his journal, Samuel's own testimony to his own humanity. But Samuel's story didn't end with the funeral. The discovery and investigation had opened larger questions about Boston's history and America's incomplete reckoning with slavery and its aftermath. The comfortable narrative that slavery had been a Southern institution that Northern states had virtuously opposed was complicated by cases like Samuel's, where Northern wealth and Northern laws had failed to protect a person who should have been free. Researchers began uncovering other cases, less well documented than Samuel's, of black individuals who had been brought north and kept in conditions approximating slavery through legal manipulation, debt servitude, or simple captivity. The phenomenon had been more common than anyone wanted to admit, persisting for decades after the Civil War ended. The 13 names on Samuel's list, the people he identified as knowing about his captivity, became the focus of intense research. What researchers discovered was a network of wealthy Boston families who had financial ties to slavery even after its legal end, who employed black domestic workers under suspicious circumstances, and who protected each other's secrets through social connections and political influence. Several institutions found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths. A private library discovered that one of its major donors, whose name was on a reading room, had been on Samuel's list. A university learned that a building named after a philanthropist honored a man who had witnessed Samuel's captivity and said nothing. The debates about what to do with these legacies, whether to remove names, add context, or take some other action, were heated and ongoing. The most dramatic confrontation came in October 2021, when the Beacon Hill Historical Society held a public forum about the Samuel case and what it revealed about the neighborhood's history. The society had always presented Beacon Hill as a bastion of abolitionist sentiment and progressive politics in the 19th century. Samuel's story complicated that narrative significantly. Some attendees argued for honest acknowledgement of the neighborhood's darker history. Others felt that focusing on one atypical case unfairly maligned the area's genuine abolitionist heritage. The meeting grew tense, with shouting and accusations. But it also produced something valuable, a commitment to further research, to marking sites associated with Samuel's story, and to telling a more complete history that included both Beacon Hill's progressive residents and those like the Whitmores, who had violated the very principles the neighborhood claimed to represent. Dr. Collins, who had attended the meeting, was struck by how defensive some people became when confronted with historical facts that contradicted cherished narratives. She had spent her career studying history, and she knew that the past was always more complicated than people wanted it to be. Samuel's story wasn't an attack on Boston or Beacon Hill. It was simply the truth, and the truth deserved to be told regardless of whether it was comfortable. By late 2021, Dr. Collins had compiled everything discovered about Samuel into a comprehensive manuscript. The book, titled The Shadow in the Portrait: Samuel's Story and Boston's Hidden History, would be published in 2022. She had included not just the facts of the case, but reflections on what Samuel's story revealed about memory, power, and the ways marginalized people resist erasure. One chapter examined the photograph itself as an artifact. Dr. Collins explored how Samuel had understood the power of photography, that unlike memory, which could be distorted, or testimony, which could be dismissed, a photograph created physical evidence that persisted. He had turned the tool of his oppressors against them, using their own desire to document their status to create documentation of their crimes. Another chapter looked at Emma, the kitchen maid who had hidden Samuel's journal and then fled. Emma represented the thousands of ordinary people who witnessed injustice, who weren't in positions of power to stop it, but who did what they could. Without Emma's actions, Samuel's journal would have been destroyed, and the truth might never have been known. Dr. Collins had tried to trace Emma's later life, but had found few records. Like so many working-class women of her era, Emma had moved through history leaving barely a trace, except for those crucial pages she'd added to Samuel's journal. The book also examined the Whitmore family's descendants. Some had issued statements condemning their ancestors' actions and donated to causes supporting racial justice. Others had remained silent or defended their family name. A few had reached out to Marcus Turner and other descendants of Rachel, attempting reconciliation across the chasm of history and injustice. Those conversations had been awkward and painful, but some participants found them healing. If you've made it this far in Samuel's story, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What does his story mean to you? As 2021 turned to 2022, one question continued to haunt everyone who had been involved in uncovering Samuel's story. Were there others? How many photographs sat in archives and attics containing similar shadows in the background, people whose stories had been literally marginalized, pushed to the edges of the frame? How many journals and letters remained hidden behind walls or lost in forgotten boxes? Dr. Collins began receiving contacts from people across the country who believed they might have similar cases. Some were credible, others less so. But each one pointed to the same truth. Samuel's story wasn't unique. It was simply the one that had been brought to light. The Christmas photograph from 1898 now hangs in the Boston Historical Society, displayed prominently with Samuel's journal opened beside it. The accompanying plaque tells his story in detail, not as a footnote but as a central narrative. School groups visit regularly, and the Society has developed a curriculum using Samuel's story to teach about photography, primary sources, historical investigation, and the ongoing work of uncovering hidden histories. On Christmas Eve 2021, exactly 123 years after the photograph was taken, a vigil was held outside the former Whitmore mansion on Beacon Hill. Marcus Turner read aloud from Samuel's journal while attendees held candles against the winter darkness. The building's current occupants, the law firm that had been so resistant to the investigation initially, had agreed to install a historical marker on the facade. The marker reads, "Samuel's Witness. In this building in December 1898, Samuel, a young black man held in illegal captivity, was murdered by those who claimed to own him. His courage in documenting his truth eventually brought his story to light. His resistance reminds us that the struggle for human dignity never ends, and that truth, though it may be buried, cannot be destroyed." As the vigil ended and people dispersed into the cold night, Dr. Collins remained behind, looking up at the building. She thought about Samuel standing in that upper room, holding his journal for the camera, gambling that someday someone would look closely enough to see him. She thought about how many people had looked at that photograph over the decades and never noticed him, never wondered who he was or why he was positioned as he was. She thought about all the other shadows in all the other photographs, the marginalized people pushed to the edges of their own stories, waiting for someone to finally see them. The snow began to fall, soft and silent, covering Beacon Hill in white. Dr. Collins pulled her coat tighter and started walking home, Samuel's words echoing in her mind. "I am Samuel, and I was here. He was here." And now, finally, everyone knew it. 3 years after Dr. Margaret Collins first examined the Christmas photograph, Samuel's story had taken on a life of its own. What had begun as a historical investigation had evolved into something larger, a symbol of how many untold stories remain hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see them. It was December 2022, and Dr. Collins sat in her office at the Boston Historical Society, surrounded by boxes of correspondence. Since the publication of her book, she had received hundreds of letters from people across the country. Some shared their own family stories of ancestors who had disappeared into history without a trace. Others described photographs they owned that showed partial figures in the background, servants and workers who had been literally marginalized in the frame, and wondered who those people were and what their stories might reveal. The most moving letters came from Black Americans who expressed gratitude that Samuel's story had been recovered and told. Many wrote variations of the same sentiment, that knowing what happened to one person from that era, having a complete narrative rather than just fragments and absences, felt like a small restoration of something that slavery and its aftermath had taken from them, the ability to know their own history in detail. One letter came from a woman in California who had recently discovered through DNA testing and genealogical research that she was descended from an enslaved person who had been brought to San Francisco in the 1850s. California had entered the Union as a free state, but like Massachusetts, it hadn't enforced those protections consistently. Her ancestor's story was still mostly unknown, just a name, a few dates, and frustrating gaps in the record. But Samuel's story gave her hope that more could be uncovered. Marcus Turner, Samuel's distant cousin, had become deeply involved in genealogical research, helping other people trace their family histories back through enslavement. He told Dr. Collins that working on these investigations felt like healing work, like helping to repair something that had been deliberately broken. Each person whose story could be recovered and told was a small victory against the erasure that slavery had intended. But Samuel's story had also generated backlash. Dr. Collins received hate mail from people who accused her of dwelling on the past, or attacking white people, or making things up for attention. Some letters were merely dismissive, others were threatening. The Boston police took the threat seriously enough that Dr. Collins had a security system installed in her home, and the Historical Society hired additional guards. The controversy reflected a larger cultural struggle over how America should remember its history, whether stories like Samuel's should be centered or minimized, whether the focus should be on the nation's failures or its progress. Dr. Collins found the debate exhausting. From her perspective, there was no contradiction. You could acknowledge both that progress had been made and that the past included terrible things that deserved to be remembered and reckoned with. In April 2023, Dr. Collins received an unexpected invitation. The Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., wanted to create an exhibition centered on Samuel's story. The exhibition would explore how enslaved and formerly enslaved people resisted erasure, using Samuel's journal and photograph as centerpieces while also including other examples of resistance through documentation, letters, photographs, artwork, and objects that Black Americans had created or preserved to ensure their stories would survive. Working with the Smithsonian's curators, Dr. Collins helped develop an exhibition that would open in September 2023. The centerpiece was a full-scale recreation of the scene, from the Christmas photograph, the decorated parlor, the posed family, and there in the background, a figure representing Samuel. But unlike in the photograph, the exhibition's Samuel figure was life-sized, three-dimensional, and positioned so that visitors couldn't avoid seeing him. His presence, which the Whitmores had tried to minimize, was now impossible to ignore. Next to the recreation hung the actual photograph, along with the enhanced versions that showed Samuel more clearly. Visitors could use touchscreens to zoom in on different parts of the image, read excerpts from Samuel's journal, and learn about the investigation that had uncovered his story. The exhibition also included his actual journal, displayed in a climate-controlled case, open to the page where Samuel wrote, "I am Samuel, and I was here." The exhibition included a section on photography and power, how cameras had been used to document enslaved people as property, but also how formerly enslaved people had used photography to document their freedom and their humanity. There were photographs of formerly enslaved people who posed with deliberate dignity, their body language and expression challenging the viewer to see them as they wished to be seen. Another section examined modern forensic techniques and how they had been essential to confirming Samuel's story and identifying his remains. This section proved particularly popular with younger visitors who were fascinated by the intersection of historical investigation and scientific analysis. But perhaps the most powerful element of the exhibition was the memory wall. Visitors could write the names of their own ancestors whose stories had been lost or incomplete, adding them to a growing collective memorial. Within weeks of the exhibition opening, thousands of names covered the wall. People who had existed, who had mattered to someone, but whose stories hadn't survived in detail. The wall became a representation of all the shadows in all the photographs, all the marginalized people whose full humanity had been obscured. Marcus Turner attended the exhibition's opening. Standing before the recreation of the Christmas scene, he felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride that Samuel's story was being told so powerfully. Grief for the life Samuel hadn't been allowed to live. Anger at the injustice of it all. And something else, a sense of connection across time. A feeling that he and Samuel weren't so different, separated though they were by more than a century. He never got to know his own descendants, Marcus said to Dr. Collins as they stood together looking at the display. He died young, never married, never had children. But his courage, his refusal to be erased, that had descendants, that survived. Everyone here learning his story, everyone who'll go home and look more carefully at their own family photographs, everyone who'll be inspired to investigate and document and resist erasure. We're all, in a way, carrying forward what Samuel started. Dr. Collins nodded. She had come to think of her work on Samuel's case not as an ending, but as a beginning. Not the completion of Samuel's story, but the start of him getting to tell it. The exhibition ran through January 2024 and was seen by over 500,000 visitors. It then began a traveling tour, appearing at museums in Boston, Richmond, Chicago, and Atlanta. Wherever it went, it sparked conversations about history, memory, and whose stories get told. Before we wrap up, if you enjoyed this story, please leave a comment below. I'd love to know what you think, and I try to respond to as many comments as possible. Meanwhile, investigations continued in Boston. The discovery of Samuel's remains and journal had prompted a larger effort to examine other properties in Beacon Hill and elsewhere in the city for evidence of similar cases. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of several buildings from the same era revealed anomalies that warranted further investigation, though none had been excavated yet due to the legal and logistical complexities involved. The Boston Police Department's cold case unit had also begun digitizing old case files and cross-referencing them with known addresses and families from the post-Civil War era. Detective Morrison told Dr. Collins they'd found several cases of black domestic workers who had been reported missing by family or friends, but whose disappearances had never been seriously investigated. Without concrete evidence, these cases couldn't be officially reopened, but they added to the growing body of knowledge about this hidden aspect of Boston's history. In October 2024, the Massachusetts State Legislature passed a resolution officially acknowledging Samuel's story and committing to support further historical research into similar cases. The resolution included funding for a comprehensive survey of archives throughout the state, looking for documents related to black domestic workers in the post-Civil War era and any evidence of illegal servitude or suspicious disappearances. The resolution was largely symbolic. It couldn't punish anyone for crimes committed over a century ago or provide material compensation to descendants. But symbolism mattered. The official recognition that Samuel's story was true, that it was important, that it deserved to be remembered. This was something the Whitmores had tried to prevent by erasing him from history. Their attempt had failed. Dr. Collins had been asked to serve on the advisory board for the state's Historical Research Initiative. The work was slow and often frustrating. Many records had been lost or destroyed. Some archives were understaffed and underfunded, making systematic searches difficult. And there was still resistance from some quarters, people who felt that digging up the past served no useful purpose, or who worried about what might be discovered about their own ancestors. But there were also moments of unexpected discovery and connection. In November 2024, a researcher working through Boston City archives found a letter from 1899, written by someone who identified himself only as a concerned citizen. The letter, addressed to the mayor, described troubling circumstances at the Whitmore household and suggested that a young black man who had been working there had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The letter never mentioned Samuel by name, and there was no record that any investigation resulted from it. But someone had noticed. Someone had been concerned enough to write to the authorities, even if anonymously. It was a small thing, but it reminded Dr. Collins that resistance to injustice wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was just one person writing a letter that went nowhere, doing the small thing they could do, bearing witness even if it seemed futile. As December 2024 approached, marking 6 years since Dr. Collins first examined the Christmas photograph, she found herself reflecting on everything that had changed. Samuel's story had been recovered. His remains had been respectfully buried. His descendants had been identified and given the opportunity to connect with their ancestors' history. Institutions had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Thousands of people had been inspired to investigate their own family histories more thoroughly. And yet, in some ways, nothing had changed. There were still people in the shadows of photographs, marginalized by history and circumstance. There were still stories waiting to be uncovered, truths waiting to be told. The work of documenting hidden histories would never be finished because there would always be more to discover. On Christmas Eve 2024, Dr. Collins returned to Beacon Hill. It had become her private ritual over the past few years, standing outside the former Whitmore mansion on the anniversary of the photograph, thinking about Samuel and all the others whose stories remained untold. The historical marker on the building had become a local landmark, and it wasn't unusual to see people stopping to read it and take photographs. As Dr. Collins stood there in the cold December darkness, she thought about the question that had driven her investigation from the beginning. What happened to Samuel? She knew the answer now. He had been murdered and buried in a cellar, his death unacknowledged and uninvestigated for over a century. But that wasn't the complete answer. What had happened to Samuel was also this. He had found a way to speak across time. He had documented his truth in words and positioned himself in a photograph, creating evidence that survived him. He had reached forward more than a century to tell his story to people who were ready to listen. He had refused to be erased. And in refusing erasure, Samuel had ensured that his name, his humanity, and his resistance would be remembered. He had ensured that he would be seen not as a shadow in the background, but as a full person, standing in his own right, bearing witness to his own existence. The mystery of the photograph had been solved, but Samuel's story would continue to echo forward in time, inspiring others to look more carefully, to question accepted narratives, to remember that every shadow in every photograph was once a person with a complete life and story that deserved to be known. Dr. Collins pulled out her phone and took a photograph of the historical marker, the light from a street lamp casting shadows across the words. She thought about how Samuel would appreciate the irony that a photograph, the same medium he'd used to preserve evidence of his captivity, was now being used to document his memorial. She sent the photo to Marcus Turner with a simple message. Thinking of Samuel tonight. His witness continues. Marcus replied almost immediately. His witness continues. And so do we. If you've enjoyed learning about Samuel's story, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what this means to you. If you're not subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos about hidden histories and the untold stories waiting to be discovered. Thank you for watching and for helping to ensure that stories like Samuel's continue to be told.